Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time, we will continue our reading of Tyler's Row by Miss Reed. We are following the parallel paths of the Hales, who are moving into Tyler's Row, and Miss Reed, who is coping with the advent of the PTA. She has just attended her first meeting, which consisted entirely of a very long, very detailed speech by one Mrs. Jolliphant from another PTA organization. Later, by my fireside, Amy and I caught up with our own affairs. James, her husband, now had to go to London regularly, twice a week, and stay overnight, she told me. An awful bore for him, said Amy, fingering her gold chain. He bought me this garnet last week. Amy has a collection of beautiful jewelry, which James brings home after his business trips. Sometimes I wonder if Amy has suspicions, but she is a loyal wife and says nothing. It's simply lovely, I said honestly. You should wear red, said Amy, studying me and looking as though she found the result slightly repellent. I've told you before not to wear black. It positively kills you. But I've got it. I must wear it. It's hardly been worn at all. Now that's a flat lie. To my knowledge, you've had it 4 years. You wore it first to my cocktail party. I may have had it for 4 years. That's nothing in Fairacre. I don't get much opportunity to wear this sort of frock. It'll do for another 4 easily. Put it in the next jumble sale and buy yourself a red one. Give Fairacre a treat. Or what about that sparkling trouser suit like Mrs. Jolliphant's? No, thanks. Amy lit a cigarette. Detestable woman. I try and avoid her at school. She wears emeralds with sapphires. Bully for her, I said. I'd like the chance to wear either of them. My Aunt Clara's seed pearls are about the nearest I get to the real thing. Amy blew 3 perfect smoke rings in a row, one of the extracurricular accomplishments I watched her learn at college. She's such a phony, said Amy. All that terrible stuff we heard tonight. If you could only see her 3 children. No flowering minds, no sharing of love and experience. Plenty of that, all right, said Amy darkly. The 2 youngest are at school. The eldest, an unattractive amalgam of hair and spots, is at one of the danker universities in the north. He brought his girlfriend home for the entire vacation, heavily pregnant, too. Is he going to marry her? Well, it's not his baby, so he says, so probably not. Could you squeeze another cup of coffee out of that pot? I poured thoughtfully. What about the other 2? Both on probation. One steals, the other fights, and they both lie. I'd give them both 2 years before the mast rather than probation, but of course it does mean Mrs. Jolliphant gets seen too by the probation officer when he visits. You'd think she'd keep quiet about children, I said, having such horrible children of her own. The Mrs. Jolliphants of this world, Amy told me pontifically, do not recognize horrible children, least of all their own. By the time your Parent-Teacher Association has brainwashed you with 6 speakers like Mrs. J, you'll think they're all perfect angels, too. That'll be the day, I told her, reaching for the coffee pot. Chapter 9. Callers. May, that loveliest of months, surpassed itself as the Hales settled into their new home. Shrubs, which had stood half-hidden by dead grass and weeds when Peter and Diana had first visited Tyler's Row, now flowered abundantly. Lilac bushes, pink, white, and deep purple, tossed their scent into the air, and a fine cherry tree dangled its white blossom nearby. Unsuspected bulbs had pushed up bravely and delighted them with late-flowering narcissi and tulips. Those perennials which had escaped the notice of Mr. Roberts' cows flourished in the fine dark soil, and Diana already made plans for new beds in the autumn. She was so busy that she had no time to miss the whirl of Caxley's social life. It was a relief, she found, to be free of coffee mornings, bazaars, cheese and wine parties, and all the other fundraising affairs which she had felt obliged to attend. The invitations still came, but she was able to answer truthfully that she had too much to see to at the moment. The workmen were still with them, and at times Peter wondered if they would ever go. "I confidently expect to wrap up Christmas parcels for them," he commented gloomily, watching their van depart one tea time. "I shall give Bert a bottle of shampoo and Frank a belt to keep up those filthy jeans. Binder twine doesn't appear to do the job." Bert and Frank were two cheerful youths, self-styled subcontractors, who were engaged at the last stages of the outdoor painting. They were accompanied everywhere by a transistor radio that blared out a stream of pop music to the unspoken despair of Diana and the very outspoken fury, when he was there to hear it, of Peter. As they plied their brushes, squatting on their haunches or balanced on ladders, they shouted above the din to each other. Diana heard their exchanges and found them incomprehensible. "He fouled him right enough. Ref be blind half the time. Wants to drop old Bert's. Never made the fourth round with him in the goal. See him Saturday?" Football appeared to be the only topic of conversation, and this was punctuated with occasional bursts of discordant song with transistor accompaniment. At 11 each morning, Diana made coffee for them. She carried it into the sunshine, and they knocked off with alacrity and sat on the garden seat. Sometimes she sat with them, and they told her about their families. To her eyes, they appeared only children themselves, but Bert had 2 boys of his own, and Frank 3 girls. After 10 minutes, Diana would hurry back to her work, but the 2 young men remained sitting and smoking until 11:30 or 20 to 12. Well, one would say, rising reluctantly, "Best get back, I suppose." "Get the old job done," the other would agree, and they would amble back to their paintbrushes, much refreshed. And their wives, thought Diana, are scrubbing and washing and ironing and cooking and shopping and dressing and undressing young children and generally running around in circles. And when their husbands get home, no doubt the wives will think indulgently, "Poor things, they've been working hard all day. Must give them a good meal and let them have a nice rest while I wash up and put the children to bed." Diana's immediate neighbors were not greatly in evidence, she was relieved to find. Certainly Sergeant Burnaby tended to hover near the dividing hedge whenever she had occasion to go into the garden, and was pathetically eager to prolong any little conversations they had. But her fears that he might make frequent calls proved groundless, and only the rattle of his poker in the grate next door, or the sharp tap-tap caused by knocking out of his pipe on the fire bars, caused his presence to be heard. From Mrs. Fowler's side, nothing was heard. Keeping herself to herself was one of her prides, and Diana only had a rare glimpse of her when she hung out some of her dazzling washing, or took a bowl down the garden path to pick some greens. But if Diana saw little of her neighbor, the same could not be said of Mrs. Fowler, who knew 9/10 of the newcomer's movements. Before a week was out, she knew that the Hales preferred brown bread to white, took 1 pint of Jersey milk a day, sent sheets, pillow slips, towels, even tea towels and dusters, which Mrs. Fowler thought scandalous, to the laundry, and that Peter Hale used an electric razor, and that the bedside alarm went off at 7 o'clock sharp. Diana was unaware of the intense interest that the village as a whole took in their affairs. She would have been surprised and amused to know that Mr. Lamb at the post office knew where her 2 sons were stationed, that the Hales banked with the National Westminster, and had monthly accounts with the Caxley garage, butcher, and hardware store. She had still to find out who the titled lady to whom Mrs. Hale wrote regularly. It was in fact an elderly aunt. He was intrigued, too, by the number of letters addressed to a certain Oxford college in Mr. Hale's neat hand. But Mr. Lamb was used to biding his time and was confident that all these things would be made clear to him if he waited long enough. There had been several callers at Tyler's Row. The vicar, the Reverend Gerald Partridge, and his wife were the first to come, and later Mrs. Maughan descended upon Diana when she was engaged in the almost impossible task of pinning up the hem of a frock while wearing it. She opened the door to her visitor, very conscious of her uneven hemline and the half-dozen pins threatening her stockings. "I know that calling is out of date these days," said Mrs. Maughan when they were seated in the drawing-room, "and a great pity it is, I think. One can feel so lonely in a new place. I know I was quite daunted when I first came to Fairacre. Luckily, my husband had been here for some little time before me, and of course he'd made a number of friends." "I thought I would join the Women's Institute," said Diana. "It's a very good way of meeting people." "Excellent," agreed Mrs. Maughan with energy. "We can always do with new members, especially on the committee." "Well, I don't know," began Diana, somewhat taken aback. "Your leg," said Mrs. Maughan, peering through her glasses, "appears to be bleeding." "Confound these pins!" exclaimed Diana, leaping to her feet and explaining her predicament. "Well, we'll soon put that right," said Mrs. Maughan, and fell upon her knees on the new carpet. "Hand me the pins and a ruler." "They're upstairs," said Diana. "One moment and I'll fetch them." For the next 5 minutes the ladies were engrossed in their task, and Diana thought that Mrs. Maughan, formidable though her manner was, certainly had her practical side. "Now stand still while I crawl round," said her visitor. She thumped down the school ruler on its end by one side seam. 17, puffed Mrs. Maughan, circumnavigating her hostess and pausing at intervals with the ruler. 17, 17, 17 and a quarter. Blast it. Hold hard a minute. After a short battle with the pins, Mrs. Maughan professed herself satisfied and scrambled with difficulty to her feet. "It's terribly kind of you," said Diana. "You couldn't have called it a better time for me. Now let me brush your skirt. This new carpet is shedding whiskers madly." Mrs. Maughan gave her skirt a perfunctory bang with a massive hand. "Don't vacuum it clean too much just yet," she advised. "Hand brush for a few weeks, I always say, until it's settled in." "Let me get you some tea." No, I've the dogs to exercise, and Henry wants me to type a talk he's giving in Caxley." "It was good of you to come, and kinder still to help me with the pinning up. You must bring your husband to meet mine before long." She accompanied Mrs. Maughan to the front door. "How do you get on with the next-door folk?" asked Mrs. Maughan in a voice that was much too loud for Diana's peace of mind. Through one hedge she could see Mrs. Fowler bent to weed her path, but strategically placed to see and hear all that transpired. Intermittent coughing came from the other hedge where Sergeant Burnaby sat enjoying the sunshine. His hearing, for so venerable a man, was amazingly acute at times, Diana knew well. Very well indeed," said Diana firmly. "We're extremely lucky." "Glad to hear it. Neighbors can be a curse or a comfort," boomed Mrs. Maughan. She dropped her voice a trifle and spoke now in a tone which was possibly more penetrating than before. "You'll have to watch Mrs. Fowler. A very awkward woman, I hear, and apt to be vindictive. Not to be trusted at all. Remind me to tell you a tale next time we meet, more in the nature of a warning, you understand." "Thank you for calling," said Diana. "I shall look forward to seeing you at the WI meeting." Mrs. Maughan stumped off to the gate, and Diana watched her departure with relief. The bent figure next door straightened itself with a loud sniff, and the banging of Mrs. Fowler's front door seemed to prove the point of the old adage that eavesdroppers hear no good of themselves. The WI meeting did not take place for a week or more, but before that event occurred, Diana met a great many more of Fairacre's inhabitants. The village shop, which was also the bakery, proved to be as much a club as a business, and here she was introduced to other customers. The owner was an old boy of Caxley Grammar School and knew Peter well. Old boys were ubiquitous within a radius of 10 miles around Caxley and turned up as electricians, plumbers, nurserymen, as well as bank managers, solicitors, accountants, and other men of business. The family feeling engendered by this tie was very reassuring, Diana found. Mr. Willett was one of the first friends she met at the shop. "I'm going your way," he said on the first occasion. "Give us your basket while you carry the cornflakes. That's one's work alone, them great packets." They walked amiably along the village street. "That's my place," said Mr. Willett. "You must meet my wife sometime. She tells me you're going to join the WI." "Yes, I am." "Jumble jam in Jerusalem," commented Mr. Willett with a rumbling laugh. "That's what they calls it, eh? Well, keeps you ladies out of mischief, I suppose. You want to watch they don't get you on the committee, though. Fair sharpens their knives there, I understand." "Oh, I haven't been here long enough for that honor," said Diana. "It's the new ones that get copped," replied Mr. Willett shrewdly. "You take a look around. You won't find many of the old sort running things in Fairacre. They're too fly. They likes to sit back and watch the newcomers make a mess of things, and then they can criticize." They approached Tyler's Row and slowed to a halt. "You all right for help in the house?" asked Mr. Willett solicitously. "At the moment, yes, thank you. Mrs. Jones, who worked for me in Caxley, comes out once a week." "Good. 'Tisn't easy to get a decent body as you can trust." He handed over the basket. "Well, I must be off to the school. Caretaker, you see. Odd job, man like. Be plenty of coke spread around the playground for me to sweep up, I've no doubt. Still, I did the same myself when I was there 50 years back." He gave a smile which creased his weathered face, reminding Diana of a wrinkled apple. "If you wants anything, let me know. Or your husband now, if he needs a load of logs or someone to fix that gate of yourn, tell him to come and see me. I've heard plenty about him from my 2 nephews as goes to his school. They've got more up top than I had at their age." "I very much doubt it," said Diana with conviction. On the following afternoon, Diana went to Caxley and returned to Tyler's Row to find that the first salvo had been fired in a battle which was to last for months. A light breeze was blowing, and Diana had noticed faint wisps of smoke drifting from the sergeant's garden across their own toward Mrs. Fowler's property. The bonfire was at the end of the garden and could have given no offense to anyone at the stage when Diana first saw it. She was just peeling off her gloves when the knock came at the front door. On opening it, she was confronted by Mrs. Fowler, dressed very neatly in an afternoon frock and surmounted by a hat. It was of a masculine nature, something of a trilby, slightly modified for feminine wear, but still uncompromisingly severe. Beneath it, Mrs. Fowler's grim countenance appeared more formidable than ever. "Will you come in?" said Diana, regretting the invitation the moment she had made it. She showed her visitor into the sitting room, and both perched on the edge of their chairs. Mrs. Fowler wasted no time. "I'm here to make a complaint," she said formally. Her quick eyes were flickering about the room, noting everything. She would be the winner at any Kim's game, thought Diana with wry amusement. "I'm sorry to hear that," she replied. "Have we done something to offend you, Mrs. Fowler?" "It's not you, ma'am, it's him." She jerked a thumb at the dividing wall in the direction of Sergeant Burnaby's abode. "He does it for sheer devilment," she went on, her face becoming flushed. "Wait till he sees it hanging out, then gets to work." "Sees what?" asked Diana, understandably bewildered. "The washing, the clothes. Waits till I've pegged out the lot and then lights his bonfire. Time and again it's happened. All over smuts they get clear starched, fresh boiled, hand-washed woolies. He don't care." Diana had often heard of people bridling and had never quite known what this meant. Now she saw it in action. Mrs. Fowler fairly bubbled over with her grievances, but with the air of militancy which boded no good to anyone who crossed her path just then. "Surely," she began gently, "he doesn't do it intentionally." "Oh, don't he!" exclaimed Mrs. Fowler vindictively. "He watches the weathercock on the church to see when his old bonfire can do the most damage. I've seen him at it." "Then why not go to him and put your complaint directly? What can I do?" "Well, he's your tenant, same as I am. He takes no notice of what I say, laughs in me face, he does. But if you, or say Mr. Hales, should have a word with that old devil, pardon my language, ma'am, there's a chance he might see reason." Diana sighed. "I don't like it at all, Mrs. Fowler. We all live in close quarters, and we simply must be understanding and tolerant." "I've been that long enough," retorted Mrs. Fowler, buttoning up her mouth. "Well, I'll tell my husband that you called," said Diana, rising to her feet, "but I don't promise that he will intervene. I still advise you to mention the matter politely to Sergeant Burnaby. It's probably just male thoughtlessness. After all, he's getting very old, you know." "It's the old uns," said Mrs. Fowler darkly as she crossed the threshold, "as is the worst." "Bad-tempered old harridan," was Peter Hale's comment that evening when he arrived home from school and was told the tale. "Let them get on with it. We're not taking sides. Anyway, it's only a storm in a teacup. That woman's liverish. You can see that plain enough from her complexion. What she needs is more exercise. A sharp 3-mile walk daily would soon put her right." "I'll leave you to tell her that," commented Diana dryly. And we'll pursue these various conflicts next time.